The air inside the Los Angeles County Courthouse was thick, suffocating. A low murmur rippled through the spectators as they shifted in their seats, exchanging uncertain glances. At the defendant's table, a young man stood with his hands buried in his pockets, his chin raised ever so slightly, a quiet but undeniable show of defiance. Jalen Dawson, 19 years old, was on trial for grand theft auto and resisting arrest. Serious charges. But the way Judge Walter Grayson studied him said everything. The real trial wasn't about the law. It was about perception. The judge smirked, tapping his gavel against the desk with an air of amusement. His voice carried a note of condescension, the kind that filled courtrooms like this all too often. "You think you're some kind of legal expert," he mused. "This isn't a debate club, kid." The courtroom chuckled. Even the bailiff, the stenographer, and the prosecutor exchanged knowing smiles. Jalen, however, didn't flinch. He had spent years preparing for moments like this. Not in the literal sense, but in a way that mattered just as much. While his classmates memorized basketball stats, he memorized case law. When they played video games, he debated trial strategies in his head. His mother, a paralegal, had unknowingly trained him since childhood. He'd watched as defense attorneys cut corners, prosecutors twisted narratives, and judges made assumptions before the first piece of evidence was even introduced. But none of that mattered to Judge Grayson. In his eyes, Jalen was just another troubled teen, another name on a docket, another case he could clear before his afternoon golf game. "Let's make this quick," the judge sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I have a tea time at 2. Another round of chuckles. But this time, something changed. The atmosphere shifted, subtle but undeniable. The amusement wasn't as effortless as before, and if anyone had been watching closely, they might have noticed the faintest smirk pulling at the corner of Jalen's lips. Because the judge had just made his first mistake. What happens next will shock you. But before we continue, I want to hear from you. Do you think Jalen should represent himself? Is this a bold move or a reckless mistake? Let me know in the comments below. And if you're invested in stories like these, hit that subscribe button so you never miss another one. Jalen had spent years studying trials, and he knew exactly how to dismantle a case. But first, he had to let them underestimate him. The prosecutor, Carrington, walked to the center of the courtroom with an air of certainty. He adjusted his tie, glanced at the jury, and began his opening statement with conviction. The defendant was caught red-handed. His fingerprints were found on the stolen vehicle. The prosecution submits that the evidence speaks for itself. The words carried weight, and a murmur swept through the gallery. Jurors shifted slightly in their seats. It sounded like a solid case, but Jalen had already spotted the weaknesses. He knew that perception was everything, and at this moment, everyone saw him as a reckless teenager who had made a big mistake. He could use that. Taking a slow breath, he met the judge's eyes and spoke clearly. "I'll be representing myself, Your Honor." The room went silent. Even the shuffle of papers stopped. A flicker of something unreadable passed over Judge Grayson's face before he raised an eyebrow. "You'll what?" Jalen didn't flinch. His voice was steady. "I'll be defending myself." A few chuckles echoed through the room, as if he had just announced he planned to fly a plane without training. Carrington smirked, shaking his head as he leaned toward the podium. "This should be interesting." Jalen ignored him. He could feel the weight of their doubt pressing in from all sides. But he welcomed it, because what they didn't know was that he had been preparing for this moment his entire life. As he stepped forward, the smirks faded, and the courtroom watched him in a new light. Jalen stood firm, his gaze steady as he focused on Carrington. He knew that the entire case hinged on one witness, and if he could dismantle that testimony, the prosecution would have little to stand on. He took a step forward, his voice calm but commanding. "Prosecution, can you confirm Officer Ruiz personally saw me behind the wheel?" Carrington smirked, his confidence unwavering. "Of course." Jalen gave a slow nod, almost as if he had expected that answer. He took a beat before speaking again. "Then I moved to dismiss his testimony, because Ruiz wasn't even on duty when the chase began." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. A few gasps escaped from the spectators, followed by hushed whispers. Judge Grayson leaned forward, his brows knitting together in clear concern. "Counselor, do you have an issue with verifying the officer's GPS logs?" Carrington hesitated. It was only a second, but Jalen caught it. That moment of hesitation spoke louder than any denial could have. "Your Honor," Jalen continued, his voice measured, "I have official records showing that Officer Ruiz was miles away at the time of the alleged incident. He wasn't on duty. He wasn't even in the vicinity of the chase. So I ask again, how could he have possibly witnessed anything firsthand?" The jury shifted uncomfortably. A few of them exchanged glances, no doubt replaying the prosecutor's opening statement in their minds. The once ironclad testimony had begun to crack, and Jalen was determined to widen that fissure. Carrington struggled to mask his unease, but the shift in his demeanor was obvious. His once confident stance faltered as he attempted to pivot. "Even if we exclude the officer's testimony," he said, clearing his throat, "the defendant's fingerprints were found on the stolen vehicle." Jalen turned to the jury, his eyes scanning their faces for signs of doubt. He could see the uncertainty creeping in, the cracks forming in what once seemed like an airtight case. "Let's say you walk into a store and try on a jacket," he said, his voice even and measured. "A few hours later, someone steals that same jacket. Would the fact that your fingerprints are on it mean you stole it?" A few jurors exchanged glances, some shifting in their seats. Jalen pressed on, sensing the impact of his words. "The prosecution wants you to believe that touching something makes you a criminal. But forensic evidence is only as strong as the process used to analyze it. And guess what? The prosecution never brought in the forensic specialist who conducted the fingerprint analysis." Judge Grayson, who had been observing the exchange intently, turned his gaze toward Carrington. "Is this true?" Carrington hesitated. It was subtle, but the delay spoke volumes. He shifted uncomfortably, adjusting the papers in front of him as if searching for a response. "No, Your Honor," he finally admitted, his voice lacking the strength it once held. Judge Grayson exhaled slowly. "Interesting," he muttered, leaning back in his chair as the weight of the moment settled over the courtroom. Jalen took a deep breath, steadying himself before speaking. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence an official statement from the owner of the vehicle." He held up the document, his voice unwavering. Judge Grayson frowned, his eyes narrowing. "The owner?" Jalen nodded. "Yes, Raymond Whitaker, the registered owner of the vehicle in question. He told police the night of the theft that the suspect was white." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. The murmurs grew louder, uncertainty and shock spreading among the spectators. Jalen remained composed, turning his attention back to the jury. "The real suspect got away," he continued, his voice cutting through the noise. "The police found a black teenager in the area and assumed that was close enough. That's what this case is really about." Carrington's face lost its color. The weight of the truth settled over the courtroom, suffocating the confidence he had displayed just moments before. He looked down at his papers, but there was nothing there to save him. Judge Grayson let out a slow exhale, rubbing his temple as if the realization physically pained him. The room had fallen into an uneasy silence, all eyes on him. "Does the prosecution have anything further?" His voice was measured, but there was an edge to it now. Carrington's jaw tightened. He swallowed hard before responding, his voice stiff. "No, Your Honor." The weight of those words hung in the air. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, before Judge Grayson turned his gaze back to Jalen. There was something different in his eyes now, something Jalen hadn't seen before, a glimmer of recognition. Case dismissed. The sound of the gavel striking the desk was drowned out by the explosion of voices that followed. The spectators erupted, some in disbelief, others in quiet relief. Jalen barely heard any of it. His focus remained steady, his breath even. He had known the truth all along, and now, so did everyone else. The courtroom erupted with noise, some in disbelief, others in quiet relief. The case was over, but the conversation had just begun. Outside, the air was thick with flashing cameras and hurried voices. Reporters swarmed Jalen as soon as he stepped down the courthouse steps. Microphones were thrust in his direction, eager hands reaching for a statement. Did you know the judge would dismiss the case? One reporter shouted. What's next for you? Asked another. Jalen didn't answer. This had never been about proving his own intelligence. It was about exposing something much bigger than himself. At the bottom of the steps, his mother, Denise, stood waiting. Her arms were crossed tightly, but the relief in her eyes was unmistakable. The moment he reached her, she let out a breath she had probably been holding since the trial started. Boy, you scared me half to death, she murmured, shaking her head. Jalen chuckled, stuffing his hands into his pockets. Had to take a risk, Ma. Across the street, Judge Grayson watched the scene unfold. His usual arrogance was absent. The way he stood, the set of his shoulders, it was different. Because for the first time, the system had been forced to look at itself, and it had blinked first. He took a step forward, calling out, You should consider law school. Jalen turned, a slow smirk forming. Already on my way, he said. How many other cases have ended like this? But without someone like Jalen to fight back. How many innocent people have been convicted, not because of the evidence, but because of bias? Jalen had the knowledge to stand up for himself. But what about those who don't? What about the people whose voices are silenced before they ever reach a courtroom? This isn't just about one case. It's about all of them. If this story made you think, even for a second, then share it. Talk about it. Because the more we bring these issues to light, the harder they become to ignore. Hit that like button, subscribe for more stories that matter, and let's keep the conversation going. Because next time, it might not be Jalen. It might be someone you know.